ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, sometimes in war, the most consequential battlefield is a classroom. Because if you want to destroy a country, you don't just seize its territory, you want to reshape its future generation. And that's exactly what Russia appears to be attempting in occupied Ukraine. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been taken across the border, placed in camps or institutions, stripped of their language and identity, and re-educated to believe something very different, that they were never really Ukrainians to begin with. That tragedy is what we'll focus on in this episode, so let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
More than 4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, millions of Ukrainian children are growing up in conditions shaped by war. For an estimated 1.6 million children living in Russian-occupied Ukraine, however, daily life unfolds with the added layer of indoctrination from institutions controlled by occupying authorities. In these areas, education has become one of the most powerful tools of influence. Ukrainian schools have largely been replaced by institutions operating under a Russian curriculum. Textbooks, language policies, and historical narratives are aligned with the Russian state's perspective. Teaching in Ukrainian has been widely reduced or removed, while lessons emphasizing Russian history, patriotism, and the role of the Russian military have become standard. Summer programs organized by these authorities have also drawn scrutiny. In 2025 alone, around 53,000 children from occupied territories were reportedly sent to camps across Russia and other occupied regions of Ukraine. Officially presented as recreation or educational initiatives, critics say these camps include strong ideological indoctrination. Participation in pro-Russia youth organizations has also expanded in occupied areas. These groups promote loyalty to the Russian state and often encourage military service. Children are exposed to training exercises and messaging that portray enlistment in the Russian armed forces as a civic duty. Analysts say that these policies form part of a broader strategy aimed at reshaping identity and territories under Russian occupation. Ukrainian children there also have faced pressure to obtain Russian citizenship, and some have been relocated to Russia itself. The Kremlin's actions are ultimately aimed at reshaping a generation of Ukrainian children whose education, identity, and future are being controlled to Moscow's advantage.
And now, let's zone in on the East-planning portion of our show. With the increasing push to propagandize children, questions have arisen as to why Moscow is so invested in these young Ukrainians. Experts posit, however, that the fate of Ukrainian children living under occupation represents a long-term strategic asset for Russia. As always, here's a closer look.
Part of the answer can be found in the forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. Thousands have been taken from occupied territories and placed in Russian families, institutions, or camps. Ukrainian authorities and international investigators argue that these transfers aim to cleave children away from their Ukrainian identity and integrate them into Russian society. Ukrainian researchers say the long-term objective is to build a future mobilization reserve, a generation raised under Russian education and propaganda that could eventually serve in the Russian armed forces. Human rights groups have already documented cases of young people from occupied territories who, after turning 18, were deployed by Russia to fight against Ukraine. In this sense, control over Ukrainian children is not only about today's occupation, it is also about shaping loyalties as well as potential soldiers for Russia's future wars.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In war, the destruction you see is often only half the story. Cities can be rebuilt, bridges can be repaired, and even shattered economies eventually recover. But the destruction of identity, especially in children, is far harder to undo. And that brings us to one of the most disturbing dimensions of Russia's war against Ukraine: the systematic deportation and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukrainian authorities estimate that, by conservative estimates, 19,500 children have been forcibly transferred to Russia or Russian-controlled territories, though the real number is likely higher because access to occupied region is limited. These children do not simply disappear into refugee systems or humanitarian programs. Instead, investigations have uncovered a sprawling infrastructure designed to transform them. Researchers have identified over 200 facilities across Russia and occupied territories where Ukrainian children are held. The official narrative from Moscow is that these programs are humanitarian, that they rescue children from war zones and provide education and stability. But the evidence paints a very different picture. In many of these institutions, children are exposed to intensive political messaging. They're taught that Russia is their true homeland. They learn narratives portraying the war as a liberation from Ukrainian Nazism. Russian educational programs have been introduced that emphasize what officials call the spiritual and moral culture of Russia. At the same time, Ukrainian language and history are removed from the curriculum. In other words, Moscow's goal is to re-engineer their identity, not just to house these children. These are war crimes and they have the markings of a genocide under the Geneva Convention. From Vladimir Putin's perspective, however, there's a historical logic behind the policy. Russian officials often frame Ukraine not as a separate nation, but as a misguided branch of a broader Russian world. That narrative has long justified efforts to absorb Ukrainian culture into a single imperial identity. And children become the most effective vehicle for the project. Because if you convince a generation that their language, history, and national identity were artificial to begin with, then the political problem of Ukraine begins to dissolve. This is why historians often see such policies not simply as wartime excesses, but as a form of colonial practice. What makes the current situation especially alarming is its scale and organization. Investigations describe the program as industrial in nature, coordinated through state institutions, supported by legislation, and integrated into Russia's broader war effort. And in that battle, children have become targets, which means the consequence of this policy will unfold over generations. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Ulas Hero, a Ukrainian MP from the Voice Party. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello from Kyiv.
So recently we're exploring the topic of Russian deporting Ukrainian children into their own territory for re-education and essentially what amounts to indoctrination. Can you first help us understand what's the scale we're looking at?
It's actually a huge scale. What we know about is about 25,000 kids. It's kids we can register, but honestly, I think it's the amount of kids kidnapped basically and deported into the Russian territory much bigger because they are taking kids from the occupied territories. They are also taking kids even with living parents and taking out kids and deporting them to Russian territory, including Far East territory of Russia. So a few years ago, Russia adopted a fast-track adaptation of Ukrainian kids, adopted a special law on a fast-track adoption of Ukrainian kids, and that's how they are kidnapping kids from Ukrainian families and giving them to Russian families. It's honestly, it's a genocide basically. I don't know how even to explain it in a different words.
Right. It does sound like this is not any isolated incident or not just like some policy being implemented here and there, but an actually a state-sponsored sort of program.
Yes, it's a state-sponsored program. I think it has ideological and a long-term ideological foundation in Russia. So they are trying to use Ukrainian kids against Ukraine. And that's how they see long-term war with Ukraine. Even if the military actions will stop, then they will try to use these kids against Ukraine because they are putting, particularly in the small kids, they are putting in their heads hate against Ukraine, and actually they are ideologically brainwashing kids, and that unfortunately will have long-term consequences. And we can see it because the war is going on for 12 years, and we see kids from occupied territories, occupied in 2014 and 15, they are now drafted into Russian army and they are fighting against Ukraine, unfortunately, Ukrainian citizens. That's barbarian strategy, genocidal strategy, but it's a part of Russian ideological and hybrid war against Ukraine.
Right. You actually mentioned something that I wanted to explore. You're talking about even after the conflict, they're still likely to be used and turned against their own fellow Ukrainian people as well. One of the things I'm curious about is we talk a lot about these ceasefire negotiations, what it will take to stop the war, and a lot of the conversation is surrounding whether to give up any territory, land concessions. But do we know anything about returning these children, and is this part of the conversation when it comes to these ceasefire negotiations?
Yes, it's a part of the negotiations. First of all, it's a part of ongoing negotiations. For 4 years, we are trying to take these kids back because sometimes you have parents on non-occupied territories and kids on occupied territories and on Russian territory. And they are Russians, they are splitting families. So we are trying to take these kids back to parents, to Ukrainian territories, and we are doing it constantly. We have ombudsmen who are taking care of the kids, and we have a big group of parliamentarians who is also taking care of these kids. And this is a constant effort, including on European institutions, on UN base, and even Melania Trump is involved and helping to return Ukrainian kids back to their families. And but that it will need years of efforts. And one of the item in negotiations in the peace plan is returning all Ukrainian kids back to Ukraine, to their families, to their relatives, and this is one of the most important, I think, parts in these negotiations, as well as prisoners of war, returning of prisoners of war back to their relatives and back to their families.
Right. Do you see any logistical difficulty when it comes to carrying it out? Like you mentioned, we don't even know the exact number of people, of the children who've been taken inside Russia because of the perhaps lack of documentation in the chaos of war.
Yes, I think first of all there is because it's kids, they are easily Russian adults easily manipulating them. Then, as I said, they adopting these kids, even with the living parents. They are adopting their kids into Russian families, and it's very difficult to do all legal procedures and return these kids back to Ukraine. And also, it's as you mentioned, Russia using it against as a foundation, as a bedrock of the ideology of the future war. So they don't want to return these kids. They want, as Mongol Empire, taking kids from villages and keeping them in their camps, and then using these kids against their nation and against their even sometimes parents. So unfortunately, it's a very, very deep problem, psychological, and it's not easy to return kids back to Ukraine. But we will do what we can do to rejoin families and to return kids back to their relatives and families to Ukraine.
All right, now Vladimir Putin, as well as a lot of Russian officials, are citing historical reasons and ties and whatnot to carry out these actions to justify what, like you mentioned, is essentially a genocide against Ukraine. Do you think that these arguments are mostly used as a pretext to carry out what they're already going to do anyways, or do you think they genuinely believe what they're saying?
I think they are using, as they are using church, as they are using kids for their only for their military and imperialistic ambitions and occupation. That's one of the parts of the tools. Kids, unfortunately, became tool in the FSB and Russian military in this hybrid war, as well as church, as well as many other tools they are using against not only Ukraine but also against Europe. So that's unfortunately genocide and barbarian strategy, but they are using it, and I'm 100% sure they will use it more and more. And that's why we don't want to see Russians moving, fastly and occupying Ukrainian territories, because they are using civilians as one of the tools in this war. How to say it? It's not only ideological; it's also a hybrid war strategy.
Right. So coming to this strategic calculus, do you think that the incentive for Russia to do that is mostly to target Ukraine to bring more pain and suffering to the nation, or are they trying to also solve their own demographic issue because of the war?
It's both. They have a big problem because of the war. They lost over 1 million men in this war already, and they are losing more and more men. In some regions of Russia, they are inviting Indian men to be married to Russian women, and they're giving apartments even as a bonus if Indian men staying on Russian territory and working for Russian plans. That's how they try to solve demographic issues, and also they are using kids for their own demographical problems, Ukrainian kids. But this is both. They are using it against Ukraine, as well as they are using it to fulfill their demographic problems, and they will have more and more demographical problems because they are killing their own men on a battlefield, and they are using men as a meat on a battlefild. So Russia will struggle and have more and more demographical problems. For us, it's not about demography, it's about moral and about the families, Ukrainian families who are separated by Russian military because they occupied, for example, villages. In some villages, they're just coming and taking all citizens out of these villages and deporting into Russia without their will and even knowledge. So they are putting them into the buses and sending them into some Russian villages. So people even don't know where they are going. And that's what I observed personally when they occupied Kyiv region. They sent buses from Belarus territory, trying to put kids and scared adults into these buses, and they took these buses into Belarus territory. That was also the problem when they occupied Kyiv region. So this is like a main strategy in the hybrid war and in their military. So they're using civilians as a military tool against the Ukrainian nation.
Right, quite heavy stuff there. Sorry for what is taking place in the country. And meantime, though, thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Vladimir Putin signed a law on Sunday banning the extradition of foreign nationals who are fighting or have fought in the Russian army. The measure effectively shields foreigners from being handed over to other countries for taking part in a war against Ukraine.
This comes despite the fact that in many countries, joining a foreign army is a criminal offense. Russia began allowing foreign citizens to sign military contracts in 2022 and later extended eligibility to stateless individuals. Foreign recruits and their families can obtain Russian citizenship through a simplified process. However, there are no official figures for the number of foreign fighters in Russia's ranks. US officials say thousands of Cuban nationals have served with Russian forces, while investigators report recruits from dozens of countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Chinese entrepreneurs are playing a growing role in Russia's online economy. 1 in 5 e-commerce companies registered in Russia last year were launched by Chinese citizens.
An analysis by Russia's T-Bank found that 4,084 companies were registered in Russia with a Chinese founder or chief executive in 2025. More than half of them were in the e-commerce sector. Additionally, the number of Chinese-linked e-commerce firms grew 140% year-on-year and accounted for about 20% of all online businesses launched in Russia last year. Overall, the number of Chinese-founded businesses in Russia rose 35% compared with 2024 and nearly doubled since 2023.
Recent research shows that Russia's arms exports have dropped considerably in recent years. The decline reflects reduced sales to key buyers due to the impact of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine.
According to a new report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia's share of global arms exports fell from 21% in the period between 2016 and 2020 to 6.8% in the period between 2021 and 2025. While Russia remains the world's third largest supplier after the United States and France, it was the only top 10 exporter whose sales declined over the two aforementioned periods. Experts say the drop was largely driven by reduced deliveries to major customers including Algeria, China, and Egypt.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.